else that we were going to talk about?
Yeah. Well, so so one question that was moving for me recently, that seems to have kind of a very practical quality to it, is why is it that we as human beings suffer?
And you're talking about psychological suffering, not when we
Physically suffer.
accidentally hit our finger with a hammer. Or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yes, exactly. And actually, it's interesting because just now, it was coming up as why is it that we suffer in this way as opposed to the rest of life? The rest of life doesn't seem to be caught in quite the same way.
Yeah, you're referring to
The psychological suffering.
other animals.
Other animals, exactly. Something
Yeah,
that
they might suffer physical pain.
Yes.
Right. So I think that's quite a challenge to get to the bottom of. I don't know
pretty
if we can
vast.
do it
Yeah, it's pretty vast.
without taking up 3 hours of people's time out
Yeah,
there.
right. Well, maybe we can just give it a start.
Yeah, right. Where do we start, Dan? Where the hell do you start? You know, what is it that is suffering, or what is it that is creating or sustaining the suffering, right? The psychological suffering. Like being insulted, not living up to our expectations for ourselves, other people disappointing us, or
Yes. Yes, and actually is part of the problem that we experience all that as being our particular suffering,
right.
and perhaps missing the fact that it's something that we are all going through. We're sharing in a sense.
Right, our own. We think of it as our own personal
Suffering.
suffering.
Yes.
That's separate from another person's
Exactly.
suffering. Yeah, I mean, I can remember instances of Krishnamurti and Bohm talking about this, and the fact that it's more than personal.
Right. But when you're in it, it's unavoidably experienced as being my suffering.
Right. Somebody else might be laughing and you might be crying.
Yes. Yes. But it's kind of, when it's deeply going on, it's like being down in a deep hole of suffering.
Yeah.
It seems to have no way out.
I wonder if it might, and I don't know if this is the direction you would take it, so you can just kind of push it. We don't know where this is going.
Yeah.
We haven't got any plans about what we're going to talk about except human suffering. But what I've noticed is that there's this constant unsaid, implicit, authoritarian principle behind things. Like when we look at ourselves, there's the how we should be and how we shouldn't be, and when we look at other people, there's how they should be and how they shouldn't be. And that, to me, automatically sets up conflict.
Yes.
So if that is a constant, if that's constantly happening in the background, implicitly, then without realizing it, we're in constant conflict.
Yes.
We may not experience it like that up front, but it's creating conflict and possibly sorrow.
Yes. Yes. Right. And I wonder if that sorrow just doesn't accumulate.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
Well, it in other words, that's going on in the background, and so it has nowhere to go unless it's being fully appreciated and seen for what it is. It's not understood in a sense as to what that's all about. If there's even a total lack of awareness that that's going on,
Right. And
that sense of authority is actually saying, "This is so. This is what the truth is."
right. It's really concerned on how things should or shouldn't be, but it doesn't see that authoritarian principle that's constantly there. It's just seeing how things are and then determining, well, that's not good. It shouldn't be like that, or
Right.
that's good and I feel great, or it's not good and I feel really pretty bad about it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
So what's creating this? And I guess what's important is to see that authoritarian principle.
Yes.
And then that turns into another what should be or shouldn't be. There's we should be seeing this authoritarian principle, and there's conflict again. It's always
Yes.
there behind the scenes,
Yes.
you know.
Yes, and I mean, so we can draw this. So as you're saying, it's perhaps helping to create suffering that has no escape, and it can even reach a point where it's saying that suffering shouldn't be there.
Right. And that's just
The same,
creating
more suffering
more suffering
and right.
and conflict.
Yes,
So it's in a loop and it can't get out.
right. And it doesn't like to be in conflict in the first place. It doesn't like that suffering,
Right.
whatever it is we're talking about.
So
It has this quality of
it's interesting if we look at that. Is almost seems like there's nothing we can do.
It seems that way,
You know.
Yeah. So if what it's doing is constantly creating suffering, and at the same time trying to escape from that suffering by going out and doing all the things that distract it from its suffering, then is there any possibility?
Yeah, and that's just a movement out of the what should be and shouldn't be.
It's the same thing.
Right, the trying to escape is just the continuance, really, and an avoidance of what.
This shouldn't be. This shouldn't be. There's something wrong.
So how does one address that? And seems to me too, there's something deeper here. Maybe we could get at some point. So we get to a place where we're kind of stuck here.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
And the one thing that comes up for me in this regard is can escaping from suffering, which seems to be, in a sense, a way of life for most of us, can escaping from suffering and
Right. And you know what? The question comes up for me, what is it that's escaping or trying to escape from suffering? And I think that's where there's a deeper root here to human suffering that we might be able to explore.
the shared aspect of it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's always the sense that I'm suffering. And maybe we don't have the time to go into this, but I think we need to find out who is it that is suffering.
Right. It's the same thing that we said earlier, that if it seems like it's my suffering,
Right.
so therefore that means I'm the one that's suffering. Immediately when there's that sense of it being my suffering, I'm there. And I'm separate from my suffering in that. Which seems to be the thing that we're caught in.
Right, and it's
that movement.
It's the who we think we are that's going to do something about it.
Yeah, or needs to.
And it's the who we think we are that seems to be setting up this notion of constantly measuring itself and looking at itself, and there's where the authoritarian principles come in. I shouldn't be suffering, or I should be happy, or maybe if I acted this way a little more, or maybe if, et cetera, right?
Yeah, which doesn't mean that, that, how was I going to say this? That suffering, I'm sorry, I can't continue with that. I lost the train of thought. It doesn't mean, though, that somehow we're supposed to just endure suffering. In other words, you know what I'm getting at? In other words,
yeah.
It's not as if there isn't something there that isn't worth exploring and going into. That's the whole point of talking about this.
Right.
The question is, do we really want to find out?
Right. And the question keeps coming up to me is, unless we understand what it is that's actually suffering, we're not going to get very far. Because it is the who we think we are. I mean, it's me that's suffering, right? And we don't stop to examine what that means. We don't stop to examine what's this me. It doesn't seem like it relates, right? I'm a me, sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm suffering. But it doesn't seem to necessitate an examination of me to end the suffering.
So how do we explore that?
Yeah.
I mean, what's going to look at that?
Very good question, Dan. And what tends to look at it, right? And that's what you're pointing to, right? It's the who I think I am. It's the thinker that thinks it's going to examine itself and learn about itself.
Right. And so one question that raises for me is, when that's going on, what is the underlying intent?
I think when that's going on, what we see is the authoritarian principle we started off with that suggests what should be and shouldn't be.
So it wants to put an end to, it wants to stop suffering.
Right, and that's...
because it's bad.
Yeah, and we can understand that. tendency.
Yeah, right. But what I'm getting at is that does that in that is there any interest in actually understanding the question of what's driving that, what's causing it, or is there already a separation there where that authoritarian mechanism is already separating itself from what it sees as being the problem of suffering, or, and now trying to take an action towards it by having separated itself from that? Is that what is actually going on, or am I missing something?
Yeah, that sounds right. So right away, what you're pointing to is this separation, this division.
Already.
Yeah.
Will that result in anything? And what it's looking for?
Right, and it kind of seems to indicate that there's a tendency to think that the suffering is something other than
Yes, exactly.
me, that it's separate and out there someplace,
Yes.
and I can do something about
I have to do something about
Yeah.
it. It's the only way out.
it. Right,
So I'm here and suffering's over here.
right. So is that true?
Yeah. Yeah.
What we've been previously talking about is self-concern,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
We can understand that
Yeah.
person wants to end suffering, and that is self-concern.
Right. But it can't help it because that's all that it sees. It can't see outside of that movement. So, there can be compassion for that thing that's moving in that way.
So at some point, does frustration set in? We were pointing out the cyclical nature of this, where, when we see that there's this authoritarian principle of the what should be and shouldn't be behind the scenes creating suffering, we want to get rid of the authoritarian principle, which is that authoritarian principle in the background continuously in a loop, right? And if we get to a point where we see, like, wait a minute, self-concern is just
Churning.
continuing this whole thing. It's just
moving,
the dog chasing its tail.
Right. It's never going anywhere.
Right.
It's always in the same place.
Right. So can there be like a real passion to what the hell is going on here? Where it's more than just self-concern. There's a real interest in just understanding what is going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then there's something else moving now. There's an energy there that's different.
Right.
And the energy's not in conflict. It doesn't have separation in it.
It has no intention in it whatsoever, actually.
It just was like, what?
Yeah, and actually it seems to me that already if I'm understanding what you're referring to, if there's kind of like a seeing of the sort of this underlying nature as kind of that it's movement in that sense. It's sort of churning that's going nowhere. I'm wondering if even that isn't already something of a different nature, of a different energy.
Yeah. So I think what you're pointing to is the fact that this what this energy that is more than just self-concern was already at play there behind the scenes as well, and exposing the circular nature of
It's all
self-concern.
Right. It's actually happening all kind of together at once, in
Right.
a sense. It's a little bit out of time, you might say.
Yeah. So that possibly, can that energy, or maybe that energy is already changed, that energy that is not self-concern, it seems to me that's already something different.
Yes, that seems.
There's already change
Yes.
without anybody doing anything.
Right, and that's the point. There's almost like a relaxation that can take place there, because it's sort of like the pointlessness of it all is kind of suddenly apparent. But to me, it strikes me that it's happening at a level that is not like a conscious decision about anything.
Yeah, and I think that's important to understand.
Yeah, it's not that the intellect is figuring something out. If the intellect comes away with anything from this, it seems to me that it finds out something after the fact.
Yeah, this sense of what that energy, that selfless energy, is itself like simple observation.
Yes, it's very simple.
It's awake.
Yes, uncomplicated. Simple in terms of being uncomplicated.
Yes.
It's not calculated in any way.
And it's seeing what is. It's revealing things that haven't been seen before. It's opening things
Yes,
up.
it's something totally new. Right, exactly.
Right.
Something totally new.
And this energy that is the sense of what is going on here, it doesn't seem to me that it has that authoritarian principle in it of the what should be and what shouldn't be.
Right. And it seems to me it's actually kind of revealing simultaneously that whole story, that all that stuff that it was saying was true, was never true at all.
So in that energy, there's the possibility of seeing something new, and there's a possibility of learning.
Right. But maybe we have to explain what that word learning is referring to, because it's not maybe quite it may not be exactly how we tend to experience that word. It's
Right.
being like, learning out of
Can
a
you
book.
go into that?
Well, so it's not like intellectual learning, although the intellect may have its place in all this. In other words, it may be there to kind of appreciate it, but it's like, it's not a gaining or accumulating of anything, it's the falling away of something. It's learning that something was false, that was believed the whole time, it's not true at all. It's fallen away. And you had nothing to do with it. The person who was striving to find the answer, free itself from suffering, never could have conceived of it. And all that a person can do is appreciate that they had nothing to do with that whatsoever. Like a gift.
Yeah. And you know what that brings to mind to me? We're back where we started, like a child,
Yes.
a baby,
Yes.
who is totally open,
Yeah.
has no sense of an authoritarian principle dictating what should be and shouldn't be. We've fallen out of that
Yes.
into
Exactly.
these images of what
Yes.
should be and shouldn't be.
We were told that from the very beginning, that that's how life was supposed to
Right.
be.
And then we can ultimately wake wake back up, or not that someone is going to wake back up, but
Right.
that awakeness can come back in and reveal the suffering
Right.
and what's creating the suffering.
Yes. And something was coming, just to go back for a moment, because you said this earlier and it was coming up for me as well. This sense that what we're talking about here, this other element that has no motive, may already be operating behind the scenes, bringing us to that very movement of suffering and what's happening in that without us knowing it, so that we end up finding ourselves in a situation where we can no longer avoid what's going on, but something has brought us to that point already. That's what hits me, is that it's never, we're never away from it. It is always with us in a certain sense.
Yeah, and it can make itself known at some point.
Precisely right.